Mauritius, can I start?
Yes, madam. Yes, madam.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Very good evening to all. Myself, Professor Sandhya, member of ARG, extend a very warm and hearty welcome to all the members, delegates in this 7-day national level FDP program, Faculty Development Program. Faculty Development Program has started on 5th May and it will be till 11th May 2021 on a theme, policy initiative and quality enhancement in higher education. This program is organized by Academic Research Group under the leadership of our chief mentor, Dr. S. Muralidhar sir. The first day deliberations was on regulation and governance in higher education and NEP 2020 perspective by Dr. Chetan Singhai sir. In continuation, today, that is on the second day of the FDP, is on research initiatives in NEP 2020 by Dr. Viraj Kumar sir. Once again, I would like to welcome one and all who are present for this second day FDP. It's a time to introduce our guest and keynote speaker for today's deliberations. Before I do a honor, I request all the participants to kindly mute the audio. And if you have any questions, please post the questions in the chat box so that the same will be taken at the end of the session and will be addressed later. It gives me an immense pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Viraj Kumar sir. He is a chairperson, Divecha Center for Climate Change, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. The secret of joy in work is contained in one word, that is excellence. To know how to do something well is to enjoy it. Doing the best at this moment puts us in the best place for the next moment. This will win. The will to win, the desire to succeed, the urge to reach our full potential. These are the keys that will unlock the doors to personal excellence. One such person who embodies all these qualities is Dr. Viraj Kumar sir. Dr. Viraj Kumar is a research professor in the Department of Computer Science at Dayananda Sagar University and a guest lecturer at Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Sir graduated with BSc degree in mathematics from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University. MSc in Applied Statistics and Informatics, IIT Bombay. MSc in Computer Science, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and PhD in 2007, Computer Science, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His research focuses on two main areas, educational technology and computer science education. After taking at both a liberal arts college and a premier research university in the US, Dr. Viraj Kumar returned to India to pursue his passion, improving the quality of education in India. Sir has been regularly invited for talks as a resource person by university across the country. He served on two educational bodies, Relate Task Group in the Karnataka Knowledge Commission and was a consultant to MHRD committee to draft the National Education Policy 2020. Dr. Kumar is also an elected member of the ACM India Council, where he leads initiatives on improving computer science education in India. Sir has many research collaborations with many universities and institutes, and to name a few, Connect Learning Initiative with Tata Institute of Social Science, massively empowered classroom with Microsoft Research India, National Program of Technology Enhanced Learning, that is NPTEL, National Program Aptitude Test with ACM India, NPTEL and Google, CSIR Computer Science Instructional Repository with ACM India and Microsoft Research India. And also, Sir is the recipient of many awards. Name a few. Recipient of the Indian Institute Silver Medal, Indian Institute Bombay in 2000, Award for Outstanding Services as a Teaching Assistant, Computer Science in the year 2006-7, ranked outstanding on the incomplete list of teachers in 2010, Rose Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Education in the year 2011. Dear friends, words fall short to express the personality of Sir. Sir, on behalf of the entire ARG family, we are overwhelmed with joy for having you with us today. So thank you very much for taking your time off your busy schedule to be a part of our program. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Dr. Muralidhar, thank you so much for inviting me, and Dr. Sandhya for that excellent introduction. So also I must convey my thanks to Chetan, who was also with me on the MHRD consultant committee. We were colleagues in that process. I want to thank him for suggesting my name for this talk, and I really look forward to the presentation. I'll share my screen now. And since we have enough time...
Sir, 2 minutes. Just 1 minute. I'll introduce one more guest.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you. And we are so sorry for that. We have one more guest of honor today. That is none other than Professor H.S. Anita Madam, Honorable Registrar Evaluation, Davangere University. On behalf of ARG, ma'am, I heartily welcome you for this 7-day FDP, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I thank everybody and my pranamas to everybody.
Thank you. So now it's a great privilege to have you among us, and it's a time to hear your words, sir, on the topic Research Initiatives in NEP 2020. I now request our keynote speaker of the day today for the session to address the gathering and share his knowledge and enrich all of us. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, and we welcome you. And over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we just tested this, so I hope it's visible. Please let me know just if you can, if it's visible, yes, and then I'll get started. Sir. Thank you.
Absolutely visible, sir.
Thank you. So I think we have plenty of time for Q&A, and I'm very happy to be interrupted at any time during the talk if you would like to discuss. That would also make this much more interactive. It would also mean I don't have to talk for 90 minutes continuously. So please feel free at any stage. Since I can't keep an eye on the chat while I am presenting, may I just request one of the organizers to let me know. Please interrupt me, as I said, at any time if there is a question. I'm more than happy to try and take it. Okay, so as I said, by way of context, Dr. Chetan Singhai and I were both were two of the members on the technical secretariat that was supporting the committee that was drafting the national education policy. And for me, it was a chance of a lifetime. I returned to India after completing my studies and working in the US. For 4 years, I was in the US, and I was always reflecting on reading news reports about the state of education in my home country. And I said to myself, I'm so silly to be sitting here in this other country theorizing about, how the problems should be solved. I mean, if I have a half a brain, I should come back and try. And, who knows what one person can do? There's so many people who are interested in the problem. Who knows what one more person can do? But for me, as I said, it was a chance of a lifetime, firstly, to contribute to the Karnataka Jnana Yoga task groups in educational technology specifically, which is my research area. But then I was invited, as I said, to as a consultant to the committee. And for me, it was such a huge eye-opener about the scale of the challenges that we face. So let me try and focus it on our topic, which is research initiatives, although, of course, it is connected to so many other things. So I'll try and hint at some of these other connections, but obviously we won't have time to explore everything. So thank you once again to the organizers for allowing me to make this presentation. It has really helped me, rethink. The opportunity to give these talks really helped me revisit some of the work that we did now almost a year and a half, 2 years ago, since when we submitted the draft. And much has changed. We have all gained experience. It's all been very nice to be able to come back and reflect on these points. So it's a 66-page document. I'm sure you've all seen it, this national education policy. And, you think about it, 66 pages to guide the policy for the whole country, from pre-kindergarten to higher education and beyond, lifelong learning, in 66 pages. There's a lot of dense material to pack in there. Our term of interest is research, and it's a PDF document. If you just do Control F and search for the word research, you'll find that it appears 141 times on 66 pages. So clearly, there are many references to this word. So I'll give you this sort of high-level view. If you just search from page 1 to page 66, where is this word research being used? Where is the policy talking about research? So obviously, there's a lot of the introductory part, which is sort of capturing the high-level view. So I'm not focusing on that. If you get to the heart of the policy, there are several mentions of the word research in the context of school education. So although I think most of us, please correct me if I'm wrong, I think most of us are in the higher education space. But I think it's important for us to also look at what the policy says at the school level. Those of us who have young children or family members in school, this is of immediate relevance. But also, of course, the performance of students in at the school level reflects then on the students that we get in higher education. By the way, I forgot to turn my video off. I'll do that now because sometimes bandwidth is an issue. So I hope you don't mind. I'll keep the video off and I'll come back to being visible later on. Okay, so that will be part one of what I will talk about, school. The part that I think most of us are most directly interested in is where the policy spends a lot of time talking about research, which is in the context of this National Research Foundation, which obviously has implications for higher education. So this will be sort of part two of my talk, and I'll try and focus most of my time here. And I assume most of our questions will also be from here. Right? But there are also these other mentions to research in the latter part of the policy. I mean, this last little bit here, these are just summarizing some of the points and the various acronyms that are being used in the policy. So there are a lot of institutions with the word research in them. But this region here actually is talking about languages. So all our various languages, not only classical Indian languages, but modern languages. And educational technology, which is, as I said, the primary reason I think I was inducted into the Secretariat was to assist with policy points related to educational technology. So time permitting, I will like to spend a little bit more time on that, although I do recognize that the middle part is probably of most interest to this FDP. Okay, so let's start with the schooling system, as I said, just by way of background. So one of the first things that I think everybody in the country reacted to, because it's such a big change, is our new schooling structure, right? So just to understand why the policy felt it was necessary, right? The policy very early, on page 9 itself, out of 66, they use this term learning crisis, right? And so it's a very powerful term, right? That the policymakers chose very consciously to use, right? And I think it reflects the honesty of the policy, that unless we acknowledge that we have crises, there's no way we can address these issues, right? And in this case, this is probably the biggest crisis we have. It's not directly related to research, but it is one of the major challenges that we have, that so many of our fellow citizens, when they go through the schooling system, they emerge without the basic abilities of reading and numeracy. Right, so reading and comprehending basic text, ability to carry out basic addition and subtraction. I mean, there is a lot of evidence, including from government and non-governmental surveys, that demonstrates this. And there is some variation across states, but the problem is that this is something that we really cannot run away from. And by using this term, a learning crisis, the policy forces us as a nation to acknowledge it and to grapple with it, right? So obviously you cannot address a crisis like this with just one or two policy points. There are many policy points in the document that try and address this. But the reason for the structure is one of the approaches to addressing this learning crisis. Our current structure doesn't work, right? And this was the picture from the policy, which you would have seen if you have seen the document. Our old 10 plus 2 schooling structure is now this 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 structure, where the 5 itself includes now 3 years at the preschool level, right? And the important thing to note about this, especially in the context of our discussion on research here, is that this piece and this new structuring are entirely based on recent research developments. And I want to share with you, you're probably aware, but just to reiterate the point, this committee chaired by Dr. Kasturi Rangan had a massive consultation effort. In fact, you may be aware that there was the TSR Subramaniam committee prior to the Kasturi Rangan committee. And initially, when the committee met, the first few meetings, the understanding for the Kasturi Rangan committee's task was that it would have to make some tweaks to the earlier draft, and then that would be the policy. And what emerged very early in one of the first few deliberations of the full committee, was that this approach is not in sync with the desires and needs of our country, right? This term, learning crisis, emerged from one of those early discussions where the committee members recognized that merely tweaking the earlier policy, or even some of the early policies prior, after all, the 86-92 policy, trying to sort of incrementally improve that is really not in sync with now what we know about, for instance, the way children develop and they learn, right? So there are recent, research in developmental cognitive educational psychology, as well as how children acquire languages, that forced the committee members to recognize that this age group, 3 to 6, which was previously, not part of the formal education system. I mean, those parents who could afford to send their children to a private preschool were doing so. It was essentially, there's no regulation in that space. In most cases, the curriculum, that private preschools are subjecting young children to is essentially the grade 1 curriculum, but then fed to children at age 3 to 6. And there is enough evidence from this type of research that this is probably the worst thing we can do to children at that age. Yes, they can master, apparently, some skills that are normally taught at grade 1, right? But they also forget those. And they possibly also learn to fear and dislike education entirely, completely defeats the point. So instead, the committee, on the basis of the existing research in this space, recognized that this age group is very differentiated. You cannot have a fixed outcome, a learning outcome defined at the end of each year for every student, because all children learn in their own unique way. Those of us who have multiple children are fully aware of this. Those of us who remember even from our childhood how we were different to our brothers and sisters. Someone may have been better at this skill, we were better at something else. We are at different levels of learning, each of us, especially at this level. So at this point, it is absolutely essential to have learning that is sort of not highly structured, right? Not fixed at the end of this year, at the end of this year, at the end of this year, right? And it is based a lot on play. So I wanted to just point out that this is one of many examples where the policy is based in the latest research. And some of the points I will talk about later really emphasize this point, the need that future policies and modifications to this policy, or implementations, most importantly, of this policy, are aware of the research that is happening in the educational space, and of course in other areas. I'll skip over these parts just very briefly. There is a lot of emphasis on language because, again, the brain, we know if you don't stimulate it with multiple languages, you do lose this neurological ability. And in our country, which has so much linguistic diversity, I mean, if you just look within our own state, how much linguistic diversity there is, we have every opportunity to stimulate the brains of our students. And it has, of course, a lot of other benefits, not just in terms of learning language, but in more generally for pattern recognition and so on. As the students go higher, there is a greater structure that is imposed. Students are by now mature enough to start thinking in terms of sort of a little bit more like silos. And then immediately when they get to higher education, this is probably something you've also seen, which I won't talk about in this talk, which is breaking these silos, right? Getting them to think across silos, across disciplines, the whole emphasis on multidisciplinary and holistic education. But at this level, they have to go some depth. And so we start introducing subjects. We also recommend this in the bilingual mode, keeping in mind that higher education is still largely in English. So we want enough facility from students to have that language. And then exposure to vocational education, which is extremely important. And if time permits, I'll come back to this point maybe right at the end of the talk. Right? But I wanted to just share here a quote from Dr. Kasturangan, who was chairing this committee. And he said that, the reason we have made this sort of very drastic change, he gave this speech shortly after the policy came out. He said a schooling system that respects these natural developments, the developmental phases of the human brain, right? That is essential. If we just arbitrarily impose this structure, because this is what we have been doing all the way through, and this structure flies in the face of what we now know through research, then we are doing our students, right? It's essential to respect how the brain develops, and this is the best that we know. And this is the sort of general philosophy of this research, of this policy, that it has been guided by best practices and research wherever possible. And one of the most important reasons why the committee decided very early on that this would have to be a very extensive effort, not just a 6-month as was originally anticipated, not just a 6-month polishing and rewriting and representing effort, but in fact, redefinition of the policy from the ground up, was recognizing that some of these very important issues have not been factored into the design of the earlier drafts. Right? So there was a huge consultation effort, and if you read the draft version, which is on 480 pages, there is an entire appendix that lists some of those consultations, the most important of those. Okay, so here, for example, is one opportunity where research has to play a role, right? This is completely new for our formal education system, and then this piece here that used to exist, grades 1 and 2. The policy now talks about having these much more unstructured than they currently are. So a totally new curricular framework has to be created, right? And the policy talks about how this has to be informed by research. So there's a piece of research, those of you who are interested in research for children at this age group, for researchers in that space to contribute to this particular framework. There is, as I said, the policy states that this should be based on our best research. And in our context, in the Indian context, and if possible, differentiated perhaps even at the state level. After all, schooling at this age group is largely a state-driven exercise. So the best state-level research, right, where necessary. Right? So that is one opportunity where we do talk about research. In the school examination system, which I think all of us had to go through, and somehow we survived it, and somehow we know things despite it. The policy, again, I think makes some very important statements, right? The policy recognizes that our current system, right, firstly facilitates and allows this entire coaching system to thrive and flourish. I mean, whole cities now, Kota in Rajasthan is one of the famous ones, who have become famous because they are the coaching capital of the country, kind of thing, right? And the obvious harmful effects, long-term harmful effects this has on our students is I think something that is a national tragedy, right? And it is happening because we have these kinds of exams, board exams, entrance exams, and so on, right? That can be gained through coaching. You can do well even if you really don't know your stuff, right? I mean, you can put in a lot of hard work. I'm not denying the fact that the students who go through this process and who do well in these exams have put in an incredible amount of work. But at what cost? I mean, if you are a student who has aced a JEE exam, for example, or a board exam, does that mean that you're an outstanding scholar? In most cases, definitely not. I mean, to the extent that that person becomes an outstanding scholar, it is despite this mental torture that they have been subjected to as children. And as I said, the policy recognizes that this has long-term harmful effects. And I think this is a very strong statement. So what does this mean in terms of how we test? I mean, we need to test other things, right? But we have this baked-in, entrenched system that is testing what we currently are doing. And in this context, the policy talks about setting up a national assessment center, right, to set the standards for what new assessments might look like, right? And I think, the policy, of course, can make wonderful statements saying, we should be doing this and we should be doing this and we should be setting this up and it should be called this. I mean, in many ways, this is the easy part. The much, much harder part is to actually make this happen and to break the existing accepted norms. So just to give one example, since all of us are familiar with the schooling system through our own experience, through our children's experience, etc. I mean, it's a very familiar topic to anybody, right? And we know some of the limitations. All of us know the limitations of the existing system. So I just thought I'd share one example. Right? I came across this nice video of a maths class, and the teacher begins by having this tap filling up a bucket. So I was just inspired by that. I just thought I'd look at this question. Right? How long will it take for the bucket to fill? I mean, so this video actually literally starts off with the person putting on the tap, and slowly there is this drain of water coming, this flow of water filling in this bucket, and the bucket is big, right? And you're watching this YouTube video thinking, my God, when is this going to finish? And that's the question that the teacher wants to pose to the students, right? How long will it take to fill, right? And if you think about the way we set up our schooling system, I'm picking a maths or physics-y example over here, but the same principle applies, I think, to many subjects. I think we can all recognize that we ask essentially two types of questions, right? We ask for facts. So in this case, for example, we might ask for, some formula. What is the volume of a bucket, right? So whatever the shape this is, I've forgotten the maths shape, but, some height into radius into something. I mean, this is, you can see it's a sort of, tapering bucket. So there's some reasonably complex formula. So that is one type of question that we ask a lot of, these facts, right? And then the other type of question that we ask, the other type that tends to be the non-facts question is, we ask for processes, right? I mean, how do you solve this, right? So in this case, how much time will it take? You'll have to calculate the volume, you'll have to calculate the flow rate and, volume per unit time, and then, you do this division, right? So we teach our students these kinds of things, right? I mean, how to apply processes or tariqas, these techniques, these little simplistic algorithms, and a bunch of facts. And if you look at most exams, certainly at the school level, they're dominated by these two types. It's very rare to find questions that are not of these two types, right? And the fact is that, in the real world, the skills when it comes to these two, are meaningless, increasingly meaningless. I mean, we all talk about memorizing and things like that, which is at the facts level. And you might say, well, no, they don't just do memorization. We also teach them how to solve quadratic equations and whatever it is. I mean, I'm picking examples from maths, but you could pick similar examples from a lot of other subjects. But we teach them processes, right? And that this is how you do the analysis, or this is how you do the step by step, or this is how you set up an argument in an essay writing, or whatever it is, right? So this can be described in these terms, and the world increasingly doesn't care for this, right? So what would a new assessment look like? It might ask a question like this, saying, okay, we want to know how long it's going to take to fill. What would you need to measure? For instance, this could, be just true-false questions, but the student has to think suddenly at a level that is very different from these two, right? So should we try and measure the pressure of the water in this? Right? It might come as a possible answer to the students, right? Maybe pressure is important. We think intuitively in terms of high pressure, water is coming at high pressure, so the bucket is going to fill quickly. Yeah, pressure should matter, right? Then if you know your subject, you realize that the pressure has nothing to do with it, right? I mean, the pressure is not the measure that you care about. You really do care about flow rate, which is not the same as pressure, right? Again, I mean, I'm not picking this as an example that is necessarily all of us are very familiar with, but this gives you an idea. Should we measure, for example, the height, right, from the tap to the bucket, right, or the tap to the water, right? Is that something that should matter, right? Is that something we should measure? Will that influence the time it takes, right? These kinds of questions, right? Something like this. Now, if you plan to ask these questions, if that's what your research is telling you, that these kinds of questions are going to be much more valuable to students in the long term, this is what schooling should be about, teaching these skills rather than overemphasizing these. I'm not saying don't do these at all. Obviously, they need some of this. But how much we emphasize these at the expense of other skills, this is something we would have to ask, right? And I wanted to quote someone whose opinions I usually wildly disagree from, but it's a nice quote. This is an opinion writer from the New York Times, Thomas Friedman. Some years ago, he wrote that famous book called "The World is Flat," etc. But anyway, he wrote, this is actually not a precise quote. As you can see, I've hidden something here. But I think it makes the point very nicely for what I'm trying to say here. He says the world only cares about what you know, right? And actually, that's not what he said. And it's very important to distinguish this partial quote from the full quote. He says the world only cares about what you can do with what you know. And that makes a big difference, right? We tend to focus our attention on what the students know, right? Not what they can do with what they know. This is a much more, can you figure out, how long it's going to take to fill this bucket? Can you take what you know and apply it in a real context, something that would matter to somebody in the world, right? What can you do with all those formulas and facts that you know? Do you know enough to know that the pressure is not something that is worth measuring? Do you know enough to know that this height can be derived from other things that are better worth measuring, right? That this height would be a difficult measure to try and complete into a formula. So these are the kinds of things. Now, if we want our students to be able to do this, I'm not saying precisely this type of question, but if we want our students to be able to do with what they know, we need a new exam system, right? And this requires research. You have a word like this, new assessment patterns. Who's going to propose these? Who's going to come up with the new methods for training teachers to teach to these new assessment standards? I think all these are very important research questions, right? So I'm giving this as a background that, even if we tend to focus most of our research and our interests in the higher education system, I wanted to point out that there are enormous invitations in the national education policy to do research at the school education level. So those of us who are interested in these questions, these are high value, high impact research areas. Briefly, it was mentioned in the introduction that I worked on this project called Connected Learning Initiatives, or CLICS. This was with Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. And that was focused on school level mathematics. I mean, it was specifically on geometry for class 9th students, right? And there were some fascinating research problems there as a computer scientist that I had to grapple with. And, we enjoyed very much working with that team. So there are, as I said, we tend to think of our research as not necessarily impacting the schooling system, at least many of us. And I wanted to just point out that there are many, many opportunities here. Right? As a reminder, please do let me know if there are any points you would like to interrupt me on. We may not come back easily to the school system in the question answer. So if someone has an immediate question, please jump in and let me know. So someone has the mic open. Did you, Professor Narsappa, did you want to ask a question? Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. So then I'll come to the.
As of now,
Yeah.
I think things are fine, sir. We would be taking questions at the end, I believe, sir.
Fine. That's fine. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so then I'll move on to the second part, which is the National Research Foundation. Right? So the first question is, do we need to have a National Research Foundation? And in the development of policies, I want to just let you know for historical reference, this was actually one of the it was in the latter half of the policy making process that this particular idea came about. I mean, the committee had been talking about research for a long time, including on day one, but articulating the need to have a National Research Foundation and putting it in those terms. I mean, the idea itself is based, as I'm sure some of you know, on a similar structure in the US, which is the National Science Foundation, right? But this has a very different sort of justification and indeed scope. I mean, National Science Foundation, as the name suggests, is focused only on science. And although the many aspects of the model that the policy proposed are derived from what we know about what worked well from the National Science Foundation, this has a very unique flavor. I also just want to briefly mention, just for the record, there were some ideas that we looked at that were done well in the US, but by no means was the US the only country that we looked at. In some of the later slides, if I have time, I will mention, for example, that we looked at the educational models of many different countries. Right? I mean, we certainly did not take the view that just because the US does something, therefore it should be good for the rest of the world, or indeed any one country like that. Right? So we were obviously interested in ideas that other people have explored, including educationists from other countries, but by no means were we said that that just because country X does it, therefore India should do it. Right? There was far more nuance to this. So this question of do we need to have a National Research Foundation? Right? If you look at the policy point number 17.9, it says that it starts off. It's a long policy point. It begins by this sentence: the overarching goal of the National Research Foundation will be to enable a culture of research to permeate, right, through our universities. So the immediate question is, are we saying therefore that such a culture is absent today, right? And the point is that this is the point that was debated, and this was why NRF came into being. That there's a huge range of institutions, right? I do part-time work at Indian Institute of Science now, and I was a student at IIT a long time ago, right? But those institutions, those premier institutions, for them, there are many things that work well, that enable high-quality research, and yet, even for those institutions, there are challenges, impediments, right? For institutions outside the top tier, things are, generally speaking, much harder, right? And all those factors inhibit the culture of research. And maybe it doesn't mean that the culture of research is absent, but it certainly means that the quality and quantity of research that should be possible in a country like ours is nothing like what we are actually producing, right? And in both, as I said, both the quality and the quantity measures. So the purpose, the reason for having a National Research Foundation is really to try and enable this culture, and that is why they're saying that. I mean, this only exists because today things are sufficiently broken, and the policy point continues and explains exactly why they are broken, right? So all the words that I've highlighted is what the NRF is trying to achieve, a reliable base of merit-based but equitable peer-reviewed research funding. So today, that funding is not reliable, right? Each of us who has written a grant, chased for those funds, there are all kinds of competing needs that the government has to address. So I'm not saying that this is an easy decision, but it stalls research. The fact that we cannot reliably, anticipate that the funding is going to come. We want to hire this excellent student, right? She's ready to do research now, right? But we don't have the funds, so we can't hire her, right? When we talk about merit-based, right? The committees that constitute the decision making, we know are not always open to outsiders, quote unquote, right? So there is a small group of institutions which often get accepted for some of the grants, and institutions outside that select circle rarely get accepted. Now, many times that is because the quality of the proposals is worse, right? But that need not happen all the time. And the converse is also true, that if your institution has the right stamp, then the quality of the proposal does not matter so much that you will still get accepted, right? So it is less merit-based than it could be. And again, this is not an opinion of one person, right? So as I said, a lot of the points in the policy are based on A, collective experience across a lot of the committee members, and B, consultations. And this point was one of those that was brought out quite clearly in the consultative process, that there is, for instance, in the case of science and technology, certain institutions, right, that easily get access to large amounts of funding, and other institutions that do not, right? And this is known, and so this needs to change. And even the definition of peer review, right? Who are the peers that can judge these things carefully and accurately, and fairly? So one of the things, for example, that was very clearly articulated is we have, out of the 900 odd universities that the country has, a large number of them are state universities, and there is capacity, there is interest, there is a large need to stimulate high quality research at those universities, and the current system is not supporting state universities well, right? So one of the major initiatives that NRF will undertake is to actually seed and then grow, right, state universities. And there's some very nice specific ideas, if there are questions or later on around this issue of how this can grow, and how do we mentor research at these institutions, right? The other important point, and this is related to this point of equitability, and this is where NRF is very different in conception to, say, the NSF in the US, is the recognition that NRF will fund research in all disciplines. So this is like a one-stop shop, right? It's not just for science and technology. It includes the humanities, languages. There's the whole range. There is no type of research that is in principle off limits. Medical research, we're dealing with this horrible pandemic. All these kinds of, all manner of research is under this umbrella organization, right? And that leads to it's going to lead to some massive challenges in implementing NRF, which I'll come to perhaps on the next slide, I think. But this is the conception, right? That currently we don't have this equitable distribution of funds. We have obviously everyone who is outside the science and technologies knows this very keenly. That there is very little left in terms of funding for other areas. Let's say, science and technology should cover most of it, right? And that means there's a lot of research that could potentially be very valuable to the country and to specific groups or individuals in there, which is then comparatively underfunded. And not just to present individuals, but also to our heritage, as I'll come to later. Okay, so the existing funding bodies, as I said, why are they not capable of doing a sort of enough of a job? And the policy talks about this, right? That these institutions, of course, have their priorities, and they should be allowed to continue. So if the Department of Science and Technology or Biotech decides, DBT, in the present COVID situation, most easily understandable, DBT decides that, look, certain areas of research are absolutely critical, national priority. Everyone understands that should be allowed to persist. No one is saying that this National Research Foundation will replace these bodies, right? Atomic Energy, decides that there's been some breakthroughs. There's potential to solve the country's energy needs with the development or research into certain types of atomic energy. They should fund it, right? And they're the best people to fund it, right? But the idea is that just relying on this plethora of institutions is not providing, not stimulating the kind of research that we need. And this research, right, is eventually beneficial to essentially all areas of life, including other ministries in the government that are not represented in this list, right? So, we need this sort of umbrella organization that can also create some synergy of purpose. Because again, one of the points that was raised in the consultative process was the number of times some of these, even amongst this list of agencies, how many times similar or very similar proposals get funded by multiple agencies for essentially the same work, right? So there is this some lack of overall purpose that is essential. After all, we talk about how our country spends comparatively far less on research than other countries, right? There are several other countries where that spend much more. So if we want to raise this quantum of funding and demonstrate that it's absolutely valuable, the last thing anyone wants in this space is to then say, well, this system is so ridden with holes that this money is going to be poorly spent. So clearly some amount of clarity of purpose, overall research articulation, this should be done. And here again, we have models, as I said earlier, a lot of the ideas from NRF do find the origins in NSF. And NSF, for example, does a very good job with some of this, with this point in particular, when it articulates calls for proposals, right? So there is this layer that is built into that organization's hierarchy that we need to mimic. It's a good idea that we should mimic. Right? We have to mimic it, of course, across all areas, which is much harder. The other point I just quickly wanted to make here is that, so again, by virtue of asking National Research Foundation to work across disciplines, we also have a much better chance of fostering and stimulating multidisciplinary, disciplinary, interdisciplinary, and then eventually transdisciplinary research. And a lot of the research, is going to be at that level. Cutting edge research is at that level, right? In terms of the governance, the policy is quite clear that this has to be governed independently of the government, and there should be rotation amongst the board of governors. All these are essential to make sure this body, really is able to focus on the longer term objectives of and needs of the country, right? Again, when it comes to actually implementing this is where I feel we will have to do the opposite of what we have been doing for the last several years. So basically, we would have to buck the trend. We would have to break the reality that we have had to live with. And this is going to be challenging. So I don't see this as at all an easy step. It would take a lot of political courage to set up an organization like this. There are obviously possibilities of setting up similar organizations at the state level, but at the national level, at least, this is going to take an immense amount of political will and courage to set it up to be truly independent, right? I mean, again, just looking at our own history of setting up these kinds of organizations, it doesn't give us a huge amount of confidence, right? But this is the point that the policy is trying to make, is that research is going to be crucial for the development of this country. And if you recognize that, then you have to nurture it. And to nurture it, you need an organization similar to this, right? And these are some of the key elements that organization would need, including the synergy of purpose, independence of governance, and so on, right? That these are necessary to bake in, right? If we want to move from where we currently are, and where we currently are, we already know in relation to the world, we are falling rapidly behind the rest of the world when it comes to research and innovation. So this is essentially our last best chance kind of thing. That if we don't get this right, if we don't develop this direction with a clarity of purpose, then we will be falling further behind, and there will eventually come to a point. This is especially true now when you look at some of the breakthrough technologies, the disruptive technologies. Our ability to conduct, just to pick one example, world-class research in artificial intelligence is way behind US and China. And pretty much all countries are way behind, but we are way behind on those things. I'm just mentioning this as a computer scientist, but that is one area. And that is one area which is highly impactful, right? In the foreseeable future, right? So we have to recognize that this is an urgent need. And so again, if that gives clarity of purpose, hopefully these words in the policy will give us that strength to implement correctly this particular National Research Foundation. My understanding, I'm no longer in touch with any of the colleagues who I had a good fortune to work with in the ministry, but my understanding is that the government is moving rapidly in this direction, and the NRF is taking shape. So I think this is going to be a reality. I hope it's going to be an organization that is able to implement this vision. So just, I'll just stay up front that I think this is going to be challenging to implement as well, but just some of the key functions, right? So this, I think, is very important. So it's going to be a liaison between the researchers on the one hand and the consumers of that research. And it's a two-way direction, right? There are many instances, again, this was discussed quite a bit, where we have research that is being conducted in areas that may have been relevant to the country a while ago, but the world has moved on. And so we have this lack of connect between the type of research that we are presently funding and that will actually move the country forward. So that is one important thing, that researchers need to be fully aware, and NRF will serve that role. But also the other side, when there is high quality research, to amplify it, to make policymakers, industry people aware. There is so much research that our Indian industries fails to use. I'm fully aware of this in my context in computer science, where industry best practices do not follow cutting edge computer science research. But like this, there are many other instances in other domains. So to be able to have this bridging to close the loop, right? So you may ask, well, why is it that companies who care so much about profits and the bottom line are not looking at this research? I think this is not an easy question. There's no one answer to this, right? But in many cases, they have stopped looking. They have stopped looking for high quality research emanating from Indian institutions. So if a US institution or a French university or an Australian university talks about something, they might be happy to look at it. But our own universities, they don't believe the quality of the research, right? And I think that's indicative of the system that NRF is trying to challenge, right? This is not to say that there is no good work. There's an enormous amount of really top quality, world-class research emanating from our country. And sometimes from institutions that are not at the top tier. We know this, right? But these are rare enough that companies who have to grapple with maybe a million things say, we don't have time to sift between the good gems and a lot of other rubbish research, right? And again, this is the purpose of NRF, is to sort of identify and amplify some of the good work that is happening. This is where NRF starts connecting most directly with higher education, right? So this was the point that was made. I'm highlighting this here again, that NRF is interested in seeding and growing research, and mentoring institutions. I want to point out that in the final policy. These were the words that were used, at universities and colleges where research is currently at a nascent stage. It wasn't clear in the final policy if this included the vast number of private institutions. But just for completeness, for the record, the draft policy did have this statement, which is not there in the final policy, that private higher education institutions will have equal access to NRF funding. So this was debated. This was debated quite, well, I wouldn't say fiercely, but quite deeply. The debate ran for a while as to whether private institutions should have access to public funds, right? Because the government is collecting this money from the public, and then should it be diverted for research to private institutions, or should private institutions be allowed to be only permitted to access other sources, right? I mean, today there is, of course, the lion's share of the research of the funding that the government provides goes to state-run public institutions, not to private institutions. They do get, but not anywhere near what the public institutions get. So this question, as I said, was debated. There was a point that was put in the draft. I don't see that clarity in the final policy that is put out. But again, it is something that will certainly be resolved at the implementation stage. So maybe this decision was deferred to the implementation stage. Right? The draft was clear. The policy is not, the final policy. Okay, how are we doing for time? So we've done 1 hour, and I still have enough time then to talk about my third part, right, which is languages in Edtech. If you remember, this is the last part of the policy document that talks about research, right? Okay, so this is an area that's very close to my heart, so I'll spend a little bit more time here since we have. So firstly, when we talk about languages, right, there is a distinction, not explicitly made in the policy, the points just flow, but just logically, I wanted to point out that there is a distinction between the need for research in classical languages, and then separately on the next slide, I'll talk about modern languages. Right? So the policy talks about some of these languages: Sanskrit, Pali, Persian, Prakrit. So what it points out is that we are blessed with very, very rich resources, right? Which of course, in many cases, we are not doing as much as we perhaps should to preserve, right? My wife's family comes from Melkote, not too far from Bangalore, where I live. And so we went there, and there is the academy there for Sanskrit, and it was such a wonderful experience to go see some of those old manuscripts and the effort that was being made to preserve them and then digitize these manuscripts. But one thing that was clear was that the amount of work that they had to do relative to the vast collection of manuscripts that they have means they're going to be at it for several years. And it's quite possible, and the researchers we spoke to, the scholars we spoke to acknowledge this, that it's quite possible that many of those manuscripts will disintegrate by the time they get to them, if they get to them at the rate that that institution is currently working on. And that is one institution amongst many. And, I'm just picking this one example because it is from our state, but there are similar efforts at many places within our state and then similarly across the country. Right? So there is potentially a wealth of information in these manuscripts. Right? We don't have enough scholars who are capable of understanding these manuscripts. Something that is increasingly relevant today, where in this era of fake news, as we know, it is so easy for someone with only partial information to make claims which are not, something that is defensible in a proper scholarly setting, right? And we should not be in a position as a country to say, how can we trust that person because he's from Harvard and this Harvard professor is saying it, therefore the rest of us should believe it or not believe it. We should have our own scholars who we have enormous faith in because they have demonstrated their scholarship at any forum in the world, right? But today, since we don't have that, or we don't have it enough, right? We have this unfortunate situation where all manners of half-truths, whole truths, who knows what truths about our past as written out in some of these documents is being interpreted for us by people who, unfortunately, we haven't been able to develop enough faith in as public, right? So the need for research in these areas and high quality research in these areas is essential. And this research is interesting to scholars from outside India. That's a tribute to our culture, our strength, right? So many people want to study in our culture, right? But we should be certainly amongst the first to be experts in that particular area, right? And again, this is one of those areas that National Research Foundation, as I said, is this very, very broad umbrella organization that is trying to stimulate research. And this is something that NRF is not going to shy away from. Again, if it is implemented correctly, it's not simply going to channel into science, into technology. It is going to recognize that these areas are just as important, right? And I just want to point out, since my wife happens to work in a closely related area, that this area is immensely transdisciplinary, right? So in her particular case, she is, a few years ago, she worked very closely with a group that is involved in some of the newest technologies for dating, and her work is in archaeology, but her work also makes use of satellites, right? So for remote sensing purposes. So this is inherently transdisciplinary, her work. And many of these areas fall into this category, right? And the reason I'm highlighting this again is that increasingly we have a recognition that the biggest challenges that the research community is going to need to solve are going to be multidisciplinary / transdisciplinary in nature, right? And somewhere on that continuum, we have to have a cadre of researchers who are comfortable with this type of research, not just deeply in one domain. And this is one of those ways in which, as a service to the nation, National Research Foundation recognizes that there are going to be areas. And if National Research Foundation was broken down into a series of sub-organizations, it would fail to serve that purpose. Right? And this is why you need this sort of organization. And just to make the economic point also clear, because obviously funding research in science and technologies, it's much easier to make the economic benefit. Well, we're funding this research, the country will benefit, we'll have all these patents and so on. That is clear. And again, we don't have to look any further than countries like the US, which have sort of monopolized much of that space, and then increasingly other countries as well. But there are other ways. And again, keeping in mind that our country and culture is immense interest to so much of the world. I just thought I'd share this article from a couple of years ago from Bloomberg, this graphic in particular, right? It's talking about the most popular city destinations, right? And of course, some of these are, business centers across the world. And, a lot of this traffic, a lot of people are coming to these places because, they're doing business, right? All that is understandable, right? But we also recognize that, a huge number of visitors to London, to Paris, to Istanbul, as just to give some examples, are coming there for the culture, right? And okay, Delhi is on this list. People do come to India also for this. So if we are as deeply involved in preserving and presenting the remnants of our wonderful culture, there is also an economic argument. I mean, it need not be the only justification that we give, but to the extent that this type of research can in some cases be expensive, needs justification, this is one justification, right? I mean, this is one of the reasons why Paris is actually very high up and in some metrics is the highest, most visited, right? I mean, it's the tourist capital of the world in some, according to some metrics. And one of the things that that France has done very well is taken its rich cultural heritage and made it into a massive tourist business, right? And then you can argue with the rights and wrongs of it, but it is a fact that almost every treasure of their culture is very carefully preserved and incentivized, and individuals, even private individuals, are incentivized to do it. And again, I'm not saying that just because France does it or just because some other country does it, we should do it. But there are models there for us to look at and to see if this is something worth preserving. After all of us, I'm sure, are aware of maybe even through our personal experience, examples of our cultural heritage that through neglect, through lack of funding, are disappearing, rusting, rotting before our very eyes, or being cleared for a new apartment complex that needs to come out. So this thing goes away, right? And that could be of immense archaeological interest or historical interest. So this is the point that I just wanted to make here. This is, and the reason I'm mentioning this in the context of classical language, I forgot to mention, to understand our past, of course, requires a deep understanding of the language of the time. And of course, some of these languages are the languages or the base languages around which a lot of the other languages were derived. So having facility and scholarship in these languages allows researchers from many disciplines to access original sources. Otherwise, we rely on translations done maybe at the time of the British, which would have had some of their own issues. And, scholarship has moved on from that time as well. Even if those were best representative of scholarship of the time, advances have been made. So there are many, many opportunities to do, as I said, transdisciplinary research. In modern languages, I mentioned earlier how we have this crisis, right? We need equally to do research in modern languages, right? We need teachers to teach. And I'll come back to this question very shortly when I start speaking about some of the technologies that we might look at here. But how to teach a language, again, is not a very, if you say, talk about how to teach Kannada in Kannada medium schools today. I mean, is that so well understood that we don't need to do any research in it? The numbers don't bear it out. We have, this lack of language literacy applies equally to the native language of those children. And if you talk about literacy and numeracy in Kannada amongst Kannada medium students in the state of Karnataka, that number is still nowhere near a number we should be proud of, right? So how do we empower our teachers to teach Kannada really, really well? As I said, is it the case that they are aware of the best practices and that there is no way we can improve how they teach, what the curriculum that they should do? Is there no opportunity to do research? I don't think so. And I think this is one of the things that NRF is empowered to fund this kind of research. Has massive long-term benefits. Even if you argue again, where's the short term, where's the money going to come from, how is this going to benefit? Massive gains in terms of for students who can achieve literacy and numeracy, especially in the world that we're now entering. The policy takes a sort of centralized stance to some of these issues, not always. Here it talks about establishing this Indian Institute of Translation and Interpretation, right? One of the important goals, I mean, even if you may disagree with the specifics of this particular approach of having, say, another II type of institution, is that their mission would really be to make some of the learning materials available in multiple languages. Again, it was mentioned in the introduction very kindly that I did do some work with NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning, and they have this wealth of high quality content, and now part of the wider Swayam content repository, a wealth of, in many cases, high quality content, right? But a huge amount of that is in English, right? And I was having some conversations with some of the professors who were involved in creating that content. And like me, some of them have been trained abroad and can only think in English when it comes to some of that technical content, right? But there is every opportunity for us to start translating that. And this is something I think, I don't think you really need to do this at a centralized national level. I think this is something that we should be doing certainly at the state level, right? So for the languages of this state that are prominent in this state, I think we should be doing this, right? At a state level, I don't think we need to wait for a national level effort, but this would be a guiding light that we want to make some of this high quality content available. And just for completeness here, let me just mention that all the content in organizations, in repositories like NPTEL is open. It's Creative Commons. We can modify it. We can translate it into other languages. There is no problem. There's no copyright issues here, for instance. These are all publicly funded content repositories, and we can certainly do this at a state level. So I just wanted to highlight that as something that is immediately possible, right? Those of you who are interested in research in machine translation, this is a wonderful, I think, opportunity also. Right? And just on that same point, they talk about how this technology must be used in these efforts, right? So this brings me to this the last part, which is the technology piece, and I think I have just enough time to talk about that. So in this context, since we've just been talking about language and modern languages, and now starting to talk about technology. When we talk about technology, there is a lot of this content that comes in, so we think of NPTEL and things like that. One thing I wanted to point out very clearly before we proceed with the discussion on technology is how careful the policy has been in talking about technology in education, right? So when we talk about access to content, right? I'm talking about even pre-COVID. So most of the policy was written and done before the COVID pandemic hit, right? There was the draft was submitted in May of 2019 when the world was in one shape. And then end of 2019, beginning in 2020, we all know what happened. So there was a further consultation that MHRD did with some of the members of the committee and the technical secretariat. I was involved very briefly in some of those. But we did look at this issue, right? To what extent is this policy, to what extent is this policy making sense in this very new world of COVID that we're now facing, right? I mean, and this was one of the questions, right? Because schools at that point were all moving online. They still are in many cases. Higher education was moving online. So we do talk a lot about this. I mean, we talked about this even pre-COVID. And I wanted to just highlight some of the points that the policy makes here, right? So it recognizes the importance of leveraging technology. No one is disputing that. But it also acknowledges some of the risks and dangers, right? And so the key thing here is that obviously, we put out new policies every 2 decades, 3 decades. There's a long period between these policies, and the policies are meant to last for that long. But technology is changing very rapidly, right? So how do we reconcile this, right? And the mechanism that is proposed is through pilot studies, right? We have to have a faster way to figure out if things are working well, right? So the point is that, it's easy to say technology is going to solve something. And it almost never works that way. There are enough examples, very expensive failures of this, not only in our country, but in other countries as well, where someone believes that technology is going to solve some of these massive issues. And the point is that this confidence in technology is ill-placed. And I'm saying this as a researcher in this space. So it pains me that is the reality. But it is essential before we start spending vast amounts of public funds, resources that are very scarce, that we conduct pilot studies very carefully. Right? And the other sort of risk, apart from the economic risk, the policy recognizes its impact on children. Right? I mean, again, those of us who have seen young children in this online schooling time know this, right? That this screen can be highly addictive, right? In fact, many of the apps on these devices were designed by very smart engineers to be addictive, and that is why people end up, spending so much time. Even as adults, we spend so much time. I mean, how can we tell our young children don't spend so much time on the screen when we ourselves spend so much time on the screen? I mean, it is they can see through that, right? And the point is that so much screen time, of course, affects their holistic growth. And for children at this age, this is extremely dangerous. What we are doing to this next generation, and also at the same time, of course, it's so easy to talk about online and using smartphones and laptops. We are amongst the fortunate few in our country who have access to these technologies. We are conducting this entire process online, but we are fully aware that there is this massive digital divide. And as we move to online, and remember all this deliberation was pre-COVID, but just accelerated by COVID, there are huge concerns that this is actually going to enhance the digital divide. Right? So one of the things that the policy talks about is the urgent need to address this, and some specific points are given in that context, which I'll get to on the next slide. So, so the point is there are these concerns. The policy takes this yes but approach, meaning technology. Yes, we should not say no to technology. Yes, but we have to be concerned about these. We should not be technological utopians that this technology is going to solve all the problems of our country. It's definitely not. If we don't think about it carefully, it's going to make many things much worse. These are some of the examples. So the recommendation is, and here, unlike National Research Foundation, I am not aware of major moves in this space. But this is, I think, one of the things that I think would make a difference, right? Having what is called this National Educational Technology Forum, right? And if you're interested, I encourage you to take a look at page 56 and 57 of that 66-page document. So right towards the end, we start talking about this. And the key thing here is that this organization, this forum, will be involved in rigorous and transparent evaluation of some of these technologies. Because today, if governments have to make a decision on, let us say, whether to install smart boards, because that's like the easiest example to give, whether to install smart boards in all the schools of this district or whatever, right? The decision making is hugely influenced by the vendors, who are the only people talking about the pros and cons of these technologies, right? There is very little research in this space, or very little opportunity for researchers who are in this space to contribute to this decision making. So there is a lacuna over there, a big gap over there when it comes to doing that evaluation and then independently providing evidence-based advice to governments. Right? So this is what NETF is really geared for, right? Is to provide to conduct the research in the appropriateness of educational technology in the relevant context. It's not enough to say this works in Colombia or in Brazil or in Saudi Arabia, and therefore it's going to work here, right? It has to be done in our context. And if it works in Karnataka, it's not clear it's going to work in Tamil Nadu, right? So even on a district by district basis, there will likely be differences in implementation. In that CLICS project that I mentioned with TIS earlier, this was exactly the finding that the success of some of these approaches were huge in some states and abysmal in other states, right? Abysmal relative to the success, right? It gave us so much confidence that this would work, and then it was just not working in some of the other states, right? So there is huge statewide differences, district-wide differences that need to be looked at, and this is an area for research, right? And also envision strategic thrust areas, because once again, this technology is changing so rapidly, right? The opportunities to use technology for the benefit of education could be immense. The opportunities to destroy education could be immense. And we made the point in the policy, at least when we were drafting some of the sort of late points right towards the end. The earlier policy, 1986/92, there was a revision in 1992 to the earlier policy. 1992, if you recall, was just before the internet revolution. Right? And just think about how much that has changed the world more generally, but certainly the world of education enormously, right? The world of commerce, the world of education, massive changes because of the internet. Of course, it's not fair to blame the policymakers in 1992. It was a massive shift, how rapidly the world started adopting this new technology. This policy, this NEP 2020, coming out in 2020, there was full awareness of the disruptive technologies that are out there, right? And I just wanted to talk about how there are opportunities to leverage, right? So when we talk about technology in education, we're talking about if you think of the infrastructure, the components, you have computing devices, you have content delivery, right? And we have made some substantial progress in all these areas. When it comes to devices, we have tried some homegrown devices, not with enormous success, but there were some attempts over there. There are, now we think of maybe the device problem is not such a problem because we can always import them, right? And that benefits China. It doesn't really benefit India in the long term, right? But today, that's the only two solutions. Should we build ourselves? Should we import? And we haven't had too much success with the first, and we are maybe long term digging ourselves into a grave for the with the dependence on imported devices, apart from environmental impacts. When it comes to content creation, we've had, I think, much more success with, I mentioned earlier, NPTEL evolving, and that's why and many other organizations. When it comes to content delivery, our country has a very rich history going back, from the time of independence, where there were educational programs over radio. In the late 90s, early 2000s, ISRO had launched EduSat, and that had enormous potential to revolutionize. Had some impact, not enormous impact. There have been some massive projects in terms of using the direct-to-home technologies. Fiber has been laid by NKN to a limited extent, but BSNL has been doing an enormous amount to reach last miles where other private players don't want to reach. So there's enormous opportunity here. But one thing that's missing, and I think this is where I'm hinting at with the time when this policy was created in 2020, which is making use of the devices that we do have for interactivity. This is sort of missing in this conception, right? Of what are the pieces that we need to tackle for education, right? And I think this is something very important. All of us as educators know that this is a very important piece, and we can leverage on-device intelligence. I think this is one area where certainly our state can do much more relative to others in this space to leverage it. So just give you a quick example. So this is, I wanted to share this example from Duolingo. So Duolingo is, you probably may have heard of it. It's one of the most popular educational apps. It's for learning languages, right? And it has been created by a former researcher from Carnegie Mellon University, who himself was from Central America, from Guatemala. Right? So it has, it's gamified, it's personalized, and it's personalized because it is data-driven in a way I'll talk about, right? And it's free. I mean, it has some ads in it, right? But it's very popular, and you might want to take a look at it, right? So because they get a huge number of people who use Duolingo. I mean, something like 1.2 billion people have used Duolingo or are using Duolingo, for learning new languages. They are able to experimentally check if this particular approach to teaching a language works. So remember what I was saying earlier about do we have the best research on how to teach Kannada to students in Karnataka, right? That kind of research, what should we teach them first, right? Should we start with these kinds of simple words? Should we start with these kinds of grammar rules or those other types, right? We have a structure, right? And we follow that structure. We expect our teachers to follow that structure. Is that the best structure? Is that the most effective structure? Can we personalize it because some students find this structure better than that structure? These kinds of questions, are not something that we have enough linguistic theories to, or in general research in languages, in the teaching of languages to do. But these guys are able to do it because they have massive amounts of data, right? And the way they do it is essentially by treating the people who join them as guinea pigs, right? So they'll try and teach half of the students who join them this way and then the other half that way, and then they'll see which one is better, and then they'll say, oh, well, this seems to be better, so now from now on we'll do this approach. Very effective in some ways, right? For developing a long-term very good product, right? And they have actually got some very interesting initiatives about doing this at the school level. And as I said, they started off with English for Spanish speakers. The person who created it is, as I mentioned, from Central America. And I believe that there are several countries in South and Central America, including some very poor countries, who have actually used this in schools. Right? And I wanted to mention that there are opportunities for doing this for Indian languages as well. In fact, they have interest in Indian language as well. For Hindi, they actually have a course. So if you want to learn English and you're a Hindi speaker, there are already almost 11 million people who are learning. I tried to look for Kannada and I couldn't find it, right? But I did find Tamil, right? It's in development, right? What upset me a little bit was that there are 2 contributors, right, who are helping this community. So these are unpaid volunteers, right? But they're helping this community develop, right? Now, again, I'm not enough of an expert on teaching languages, but if there are experts in this audience or elsewhere who think that this approach to learning, let's say English or any other language, is a good one, then it would be good to see that for Kannada, that this number could be exceeded and then these things could be built. As I said, this Hindi thing began with, I forget how many contributors, but it wasn't a huge number. And once it has been developed, they have a process and then they can, activate a large number of learners. Right? So they have some research about how effective this is. I'm not saying this is the only approach. I'm just mentioning this as an example where we could learn some lessons. One thing that the policy does talk about, and I'll probably make this the last point and then we'll have time for questions. The policy talks about how we have a unique opportunity if you're interested in natural language processing. And I mentioned earlier about how important it is to make content available automatically using technology. So we have a huge number of people learning languages in schools, and we have a huge need to, if you want to use technologies like natural language processing, to label, right, so that these AI technologies can do their magic, right? So the policy makes it very clear. This is an open invitation to researchers in this space. Can we marry these two? There's the need for data, label data on the one hand. There is a huge number of people capable of labeling data. In fact, this is actually, this is also where Duolingo is going at some level. But it's clear that Duolingo is only going to cater to some languages in the world. And at present, for example, Kannada is not high on their priority list, right? It should be for this state, for researchers in this state, for this part of the world. And I think this is an opportunity for us to do amazing research. Those of you who are specifically in this space, I just wanted to share that. Okay, I'm out of time. I don't want to eat into our question time. I have a couple more slides, which I can always come back to later. In fact, I think this was the last slide. It just talked about disruptive technologies in general. It just talked about how we could set up for this. I think this was the point I was making earlier, where this policy was created at a time when these disruptive technologies have emerged. And so it's very important to have a mechanism to think about how they impact education, how they impact the world of work, what do we teach at the school level, what do we teach at the undergraduate level, how do we facilitate research in these areas. There are some points I can come back to those if there are specific questions. Okay, so I'll end here. Okay, I'll skip this slide. I'll come back to it later. If there are questions, I'll end here. Thank you so much. And I'm very happy to take your questions.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. It was a very wonderful session, and hats off to you. Being a computer scientist, still you have put a lot of your efforts and research, really enlightened this session. I don't know how many presenters here. The delegates are sitting from language background, non-language backgrounds, and what you call it as commerce background, management background. I think this is the first platform where you have given enough of information about how you can do the research even in the field of languages too. Thank you very much, sir, for your very clear presentation and sharing your very rich information with all of us. Thank you so much. Now I call upon Dr. Sai Ram to take a few questions from the audience and for a discussion.
Thank you, madam. Sir, it was indeed a wonderful presentation. It was eye-opener for most of us. Sir, there is one question from Madhu Ashwini. She asks, Duolingo is only for English. Sir, can you suggest any other app for other languages?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So my internet failed just after I finished the presentation. So someone was looking out for me for the.
Okay, sir. Okay. Sir, we were just very, very impressed with your presentation, sir. It was really an eye-opener, and you just took us through quite a lot of very, very, very important things. You highlighted on. I was very much interested in something called as this classical language research. It was really very, really nice. And one more thing which I thought was the biggest crisis in India was this pandemic. But in your presentation, you made a mention of there was a learning crisis. I think that is even bigger crisis than this pandemic crisis. So thank you and thanks a lot once again. Sir, there are a few very interesting questions to you, sir. If I could take you through that.
Please.
Sir, Madam Madhu Ashwini has posted a question. Duolingo is only for English. Sir, can you suggest any other app for other languages?
So Duolingo is for if you are a speaker of language A and you want to learn language B, right? Today, by far, the language B that you want to learn, the biggest such language is English, but there are other languages as well. It is not specific to India, and so many of these other languages are, for example, European languages, French and Spanish and things like that. There are other languages also, right? So the key thing that the way they work is they have what is called an incubator, right? It's not like a technology incubator. They have a process essentially. So if you are a speaker of language A and want to or fluent in both languages, they have a process, right? So if you want to learn, so for example, if you wanted to use their process to create learn Kannada, if you're a Tamil speaker and you want to learn Kannada, right? In principle, you could follow their process, but there's no reason to follow their process. I'm just mentioning this as one of the hugely successful uses of technology in language education. Listen to watch some of the initial talks that the creator gave, right? As I mentioned, he comes from a very poor country, Guatemala, which has suffered a lot actually at the hands of the US amongst other countries. Then he went to go do his studies in the US. He had to learn English, and then he became a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, one of the top research universities in the country. And then he developed this product, right? So there's a lot of human element to that research and that product development. But similarly, it's possible to follow that model in our country, right? And this is something that we don't have to wait for a US-based researcher to do for us. I think we should do it for ourselves, right?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. There is another interesting question from Sharda, madam. She asks, what is the ratio of funds allocated for social science research? If any, are they funded by NRF?
I'm sorry, I missed the second half of the question. What is the ratio of social funds allocated for social science research? Then I missed the rest of the question.
Are they funded by NRF, National Research?
Okay, so yeah. So clearly today we don't have NRF. Today the opportunities for funding in social sciences is very small compared to science and technology. Increasingly, the need for research in social sciences is going to be enormous, right? Particularly transdisciplinary research with other areas, including some of the technologies, right? So it is recognizing this, that by breaking it into silos and saying these silos are important from a long-term economic or short-term economic perspective, and those ones are less so, we are completely doing ourselves a disservice. So if you are a social scientist, please be aware that your research is going to be highly prized, highly valuable, and if we do NRF correctly, this will be recognized, especially for researchers who are doing transdisciplinary research. So working, for instance, so you are using your social science skills to figure out how, let us say, certain app usage is affecting the livelihoods of farmers or school children or whatever it is, right? So where you are aware enough of the technology to be able to understand its impacts, because at the end of the day, technology is going to be such a major driver of everyday life. We as human beings have to respond. And there are some scholars who believe we are not in a position to respond unless we can turn to our social scientist scholars for advice and guidance and research.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. So there is another question from Piyush Sahai. He asks if there are any alternative assessment and evaluation that can be opted by institutions of higher education.
So one of the things that the policy says very clearly, and in this sense, it repeats what earlier policies have tried to articulate, which is the need for autonomy. Institutions should be autonomous. Within institutions, faculty, teachers should be given as much autonomy as possible to decide what is important, to experiment, to be given enough room to experiment, right? So I think if we expect that answers will be provided, then we are only as good as the quality of answers that this one centralized body is providing. And I think our experience with that is it's not been so great. So I think all of us as educators are capable of doing our own experiments. We know our students better than in many cases, other scholars. So I'll just give one example of this, because we were mentioning at the start, I collaborated with NPTEL, Google, and ACM India on this test. This was in the context of programming. But my colleagues on that, we were designing this programming assessment national level. My colleagues were almost all from the premier institutions. I was the odd person out. I was from a small private university, right? I was able to give some perspective to my colleagues about the kinds of questions that students outside the IIT system would be capable of tackling. Right? So our goal was very clear. We were trying to do a national level assessment of programming skills, but my colleagues were coming at it from the perspective that they were most familiar with, as all of us do. I was also coming from my perspective. So I think having this diversity of perspectives is very important. We have to trust that, Professor A from College B will know her students better than Professor C from College D or from IIT. Right? And we have to respect that and allow for that. That doesn't mean we don't have any quality checks. We still have quality checks. We still have accreditation, a very important part of the whole thing. But we don't mandate that everyone should do this kind of question. I think we should experiment.
Sir, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Sir, I have a personal question, if you would permit me.
Please.
Sir, actually, this placement, training and placement, of course, I'm not making a mention of training. The placement wing of the college have to be extremely proactive today. When a student takes an admission in an institution, the first question that he asks the college authorities is there a good placement institution? When I met one of the MBA directors were agitated with this particular model. When he used to say, when a student comes to me, he doesn't ask me, what is the quality of the teaching? What is the profile of the teachers? How many years of experience your faculty has? What is the research contribution? Rather, he asked me, is there a good placement? He said, I don't run a job fair, but I'm running an educational institution. Why suddenly, I think actually IIMs and IITs were first came out this model of placements, I believe. And today, every other college focuses more on placement. And even a person who seeks admission in an institution is more looking towards the placement cell rather than the teaching learning process. Can you just tell me your views on that, sir?
I have deep, strong views on it as an educationist like you. So I think it's something that we have to grapple with in two ways. I think that I would suggest that I think we should grapple with much more as educators. The first thing is, okay, we realize that this is a reality of the world that we are living. A lot of students are coming to us, are willing to pay whatever number of lakhs of rupees or whatever their fee is to get educated, to get that certificate. And then they're looking to recuperate that through a good job, right? So we have to recognize that that's the reality of the situation, right? One way in which I think we can leverage it to our advantage as educators is, I'm speaking now particularly from a technical degree program. I teach computer science. I would like to know, as a computer science educator, what are the skills that these people are interested in my students having, right? Why are they rejecting my students? If they don't offer them a placement, what are they missing? And then does that reflect in my curriculum, right? So that doesn't mean that, today they want this technology, therefore tomorrow I should have a course in that. It doesn't mean I should follow them in lockstep, but I should be aware at a very clear level of understanding what are the skills that they are looking for that we are not providing. And I'll give just one example of this. I learned this not from our placement office, but from alumni, people who graduated. They came and told me, sir, your course was very nice, right? We enjoyed it. But frankly, there's nothing in that course that we learned, that we use on an everyday basis. I'm fine with that input. Doesn't mean that I go into my board of studies and say, we don't teach this course anymore, right? The other piece of information, they said, we had this other course where they taught us this software. Instead, if they had taught us this software, we would have been much better prepared. My colleagues from IITs are fluent in that software. That is something very actionable. It's a question of change that software to this software, right? And we could do that. There's nothing wrong, no reason why we shouldn't use that. But our faculty was not up to date on that. So keeping up to date is one thing. The other thing, and this gets to a point that I didn't have time to discuss at all, in the policy with higher education, it talks about the move towards holistic and multidisciplinary education, liberal arts education. And I think in the placement context, this is a particular tension, right? If you think about placement as the only metric, who is aligned towards that metric? Who values that metric? Probably students coming in and their parents, right? They want to see that number, right? Probably the institution, the management of the institution cares about it because that is a number that is easy to digest, easy to talk about, 100% placement, whatever the number is, the average salary, etc. That drives good quality students. It completes this virtuous cycle for the institution. So institutions care about it. If you are churning out placement-ready graduates, industry cares about that a lot. Right? But I want to talk about that issue in the context of rapidly changing world of work by disruptive technologies like AI. Right? What does it mean for the graduates' long-term benefits? I'm not talking about the first job that he or she gets. That one, the placement office and whatever else you'll supply can fine-tune and get that person job ready on day one. I can run this wonderful institution. I can promise the person who comes in job ready on day one. His industry is very happy this person is job ready on day one for job number one when he or she graduates for job number one. What if in the process we have over fine-tuned our education? We have not given enough of a broad base, and that person is incapable of doing that job because 5 years from now or 10 years from now or 3 years from now, an AI system comes in and is much better at that job, right? I think that is, today it may sound very science fiction-y, but it's increasingly the reality. We should prepare for that, and we have to give our students a broad base. So definitely we can't overstress the placement as the only metric. Let's have a cup of tea also. My throat is getting dry, but please, I'm happy to listen to the next question.
Thank you, sir. Now, there is another question from Sugana Rishi. She asks, is there any funding agencies in subject specifications research proposals?
I'm not 100% sure what the question is. Maybe if you can unmute and ask the question. Is subject specific meaning what exactly, for example?
I'm also not. Maybe subject specific is there separate institutions which fund commerce or HR or marketing, something like that. That could be the question, I believe.
No, as I said, I think so the model that is going to be followed, as I said, is there will be calls in certain areas that have been identified, and certainly certain subjects would be relevant to that. Increasingly, as I said, it will be something that for all researchers to focus on multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary research, right? So increasingly, it won't be funding for problems in just one domain, right? The world is, look at climate change, look at lots of things. All the big problems are multidisciplinary. So we need as researchers also to start interacting with researchers from other spaces, and there is, I think, huge opportunity there.
Thank you, sir. I think we will take one last question, sir. I understand you're also quite tired and you've been continuously talking for past 2 hours.
My dear wife gave me a cup of tea, so I'm very happy. Please carry on. I'm happy to. If there are questions, we can continue till we have time.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, there is one question. How NEP is helping the students to improve their skill sets rather than theory-based knowledge?
So I mentioned this in the school context, right, where the NEP recognizes that this system of evaluation exams that we currently have, that we subject all our school children to, which is now upwards of the entry level is upwards of 90%. By the time we come to class 10th and 12th, the number falls down enormously. But that large number of students is subjected to essentially mental torture. This is not conducive to education. I'll share a personal example of this. So I had a student who later on I found out, this is an engineering college. I later found out he had been to Kota in Rajasthan. One of these absolutely well trained for JEE. We'll take you night and day, train you for this entrance exam. right? And he didn't get into IIT. He came to the private institution that I was teaching at, and I, would give my own kind of exam. I mentioned the importance of experimentation. I'm constantly, every time I teach, I'm interested in experimenting with other kinds of assessment instruments. I sometimes have to fight with my management for doing it. I like that fight. I think it's good. It's good opportunity to interact. And I gave my exam, and he did really badly in my exam. And afterwards, we had a 45-minute conversation trying to understand, because I knew he was sharp. I mean, he would talk in class, and he was sharp. He made a comment after about 25 minutes into the conversation, which that clicked. What was the problem? Because he said, "Sir, I don't understand how to crack your questions." And the minute he used that word, crack my questions, then I understood how he was thinking. Because he was looking at it from the perspective of what he had learned in these coaching classes, that every question has a tariqa, a pattern. If you can figure that out, you know the answer. And he was just looking at my question, trying to do pattern matching. And I said, "Abhishek, all my questions will make you think. You have to reflect on what you know. You have to think about if it applies. You have to try different approaches. If you try and take the first pattern that comes into your head, you're almost certainly going to be wrong. You will come up with a totally nonsense answer." And that's what was happening. He was writing total nonsense on his answers. And it took him, he did poorly on the next exam. He did much better on the final. Right? So it took him a while to react to that advice, right? And I just reflected on the fact that, it's not his fault that he was subjected to a system which stressed that pattern matching at this very superficial level is what education is. This is what makes you bright. This is what makes you brilliant. The fact that you can crack JEE or whatever it is, I'm not picking only on JEE, but that system that if you get 99.9% in your board exam, you must be brilliant, yaar. No, not at all. Unfortunately, not at all, right? We have got the wrong metrics. We are promoting the wrong things, generally speaking. Very few places where we are doing this. This is where the policy is trying to say, no, this is hurting us. It's hurting us children. It's hurting the next generation of Indians to think that this is what good education is. I think we have to change that. That's what the policy talks about when it says we need I think assessment drives a lot of education. If we can get assessment correctly, I think we can do better on many other things.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot. Today we are living in a world where it is research or perish. In that regard, you have given us insights, quite a lot of insights about research. We are extremely grateful to you. And our team is picking up questions and sending it to me, and I'm asking. There are quite a lot of other questions. We are unable to take every question. Sir, in our feedback forms, dear participants, in our feedback forms, there is a particular space for you to ask the questions. All these questions would be sent to Viraj Kumar sir. If at his leisure, he can answer these questions and we will revert back to you. And don't feel neglected if we have not taken all your questions. Once again, thank you, Viraj Kumar sir, for spending time with us. Over to you, Sandhya madam. Over to you, Sandhya madam.
Thank you, Sairam sir, for such a wonderful interaction and solving all the doubts of the participants. Viraj Kumar sir, it's really wonderful that you answered a lot of questions. I hope all the participants have got, cleared about their doubts, whatever they had towards today's session. Thank you very much, sir. Now I request Professor Nasappa sir to render the vote of thanks.
Thank you, madam. Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes, sir. Very much. Yes, sir. Very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening to one and all. On behalf of Academic Research Group, it's my privilege to propose vote of thanks on second day of 7 days FDP on Policy Initiative and Quality Enhancement in Higher Education. My heart fills with lots of gratitude and respect to thank our respected delegate for accepting our invitation and supporting the event by their gusto and enthusiasm. I would like to thank the distinguished guest speaker of this day, Dr. Viraj Kumar, for not only sparing their invaluable time for us to grace this occasion, and also for enlightening us with their commendable talk on research initiatives in NEP 2020. Thanks a lot, sir, for imbibing knowledge regarding present schooling system effect on higher education, that is NRF again, and its functions, Indian universities' role in research for welfare of the country compared to foreign universities, need for the research in classical and modern languages and educational technology, the challenge of access to online content now and even before COVID-19, National Educational Technology Forum, that is NEP, and other research initiative concepts, and enhancing our understanding pertaining to the NEP 2020. You have indeed put best of your efforts to make this event unforgettable. I am running short of words to express my humble thanks to our speaker, Dr. Viraj Kumar, for insightful knowledge. You have provided us valuable support in enhancing and enriching our 7 days FDP second day program. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And my thanks to the organizers and to all the people who thanked in the chat section. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you,
so
sir.
Nice. Wonderfully interactive. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. And special thanks to Dr. H.S. Anita ma'am, Honorable Registrar Evaluation, Davangere University, for extending support to our FDP by active participation on behalf of ARG. Thank you very much, ma'am. Next, I would like to thank the torch bearer of this event, that is our respected Dr. Muralidhar sir, for leading and inspiring us in working towards the goal of conducting this FDP. We are extremely thankful to our sir for his huge support all times. Thank you, Muralidhar sir. This vote of thanks would be largely incomplete without expressing my gratitude to Dr. Narendra sir and his team for the technical support. Thank you, Narendra sir and team. Furthermore, I take immense pleasure in extending my sincere thanks to all the members of ARG and all my dear fellow participants for your active participation and cooperation in making the second day FDP program a resounding success. Thank you very much, and thanks to one and all.
Thank you, Professor Nasappa, sir.
Thank you,
Thanks
Professor.
for your wonderful vote of thanks. Before we sign out, dear participants, tomorrow we have the session, that the third day of Faculty Development Program by Professor M.L. Sai Kumar, motivational speaker, former professor, IPE, Institute of Public Enterprise, Hyderabad, Telangana. Sir will be addressing on a topic, academic leadership, a journey towards teacher career progression. I request all the participants, delegates, everyone to be on time for the tomorrow's session and be present, make our 7 days FDP more successful. Sir, last but not the least, I would like to thank Viraj Kumar sir, Murli sir, all the delegates, participants, committee, core committee, technical people, everyone for your patiently attending the session and making the session successful. Thank you, one and all. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Just a small information, the feedback form has been posted. Kindly fill the feedback form.
Thank you, Sairam, sir. I think we can sign out the session. Have a good day.
Thank you very
Take
much.
care.
Very much.
Stay
Stay
safe.
safe. Yeah.
Stay at home.
Thank you, sir.